Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. This is Irresistible Digitisation, the players, the potential and privacy with Dr. Ian Oppermann. Thanks for your time, Ian. Look, data sharing comes with a wide range of challenges, broadly categorised as data format meaning, legal obligations, privacy, data security and concerns about unintended consequences of data sharing. Today, Ian's going to present on how to develop sharing frameworks which address these technical challenges and embed regulatory frameworks and anticipate and address concerns as the fairness and equity of outcomes in order to maintain trust of consumers and citizens. On that note, I'd love to hand over to Ian, and as always, people, please use the Q&A to send any questions through, as Ian would love to see some of those, and the chat function's there if there's anything else you'd like to raise. So Ian, over to you, mate. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Ross. Pleasure to be here. And it's really wonderful to hear about some of those towns that people are dialing in from. I'm personally originally from Maryborough, north of Brisbane. And we at least got a Toowoomba person in, so that's great. Maybe not anyone from Maryborough. So today, it's about the irresistible digitisation and a little bit about the philosophy of data and science, a little bit about what I do as a day job, and then quite a bit more about addressing one of the bigger challenges, which is around data sharing and data sharing frameworks. But let's begin. I love this picture. This is actually Brisbane about to be hit by a storm, and those of you who are Brisbane-based might even remember this from October about 2 years ago. Cities are very, very complex places, and in fact, it's hard to imagine a more complex place than a city. Over the entire lifetime of human beings, we've slowly but surely become more urbanized, to a point where in around about 2009, 2010, for the first time ever, we became an urban species. There are approximately 7.6 billion of us living on the planet. That's expected to grow over time, and more of us will live in urban environments. They are the most productive things human beings have ever created, but they're also the most complex things that human beings have ever created. But interestingly, human beings don't deal with complexity terribly well. Inside that city, so you can see all these office blocks where there's a point of light in each one of those office blocks, where there's someone sitting at a desk or sitting in a meeting, really trying to simplify the world around them. We all know the acronym, we've all heard it growing up, keep it simple. Stupid. Because we, as human beings, really don't deal with complexity. So we try and simplify the world around us in order to make progress, to plan, to really do things with the resources that we've got. But every single one of those points of light, every one of those offices is physically connected to every other office in the building. It's physically connected, it's connected by electricity, by telecoms, by a variety of other structural means. And every one of those buildings is connected to every other building by water, by sewage, by electricity, by roads. And it's really hard not to see that very complex city in a much, much bigger environment, which is the storm that's about to hit. And in the short term, we call that weather. In the long term, we talk about the environment or the ecosystem in which we live in. And we run the risk as human beings of simplifying away the heart of the problem. By keeping it simple, we run the risk of addressing the problem right in front of us, or a problem which we think is more tractable than actually addressing the true nature of the challenge that we're looking at, the true nature of the complexity of the issues we're looking at. And to be fair, the problems we care about most in life are complex, or in fact even wicked problems. They're complex, they're subtle, and ultimately they have people's behavior at their heart. And when we think about people's behavior, people don't behave as linear models or as rational consumers. People behave in complex ways. And when we try to influence or change or modify or interact with people-based problems, then we really need to embrace much, much more of that complexity. And I mentioned, of course, that we're living in an ever more densely populated world. 2009 was the point where we estimated that we became an urban species for the first time in our entire human history. And we know that the United Nations has projected that by 2050, there'll be 9.6 billion people on the planet, up from today's estimate of 7.6 billion people. 2050 is only 32 years away. In fact, it's closer to 31 years away. 2050 is one generation into the future. And we're talking about an extra 2 billion people living on the planet. We're talking about those extra 2 billion people more and more commonly living in urban environments, which means that we have an incredible intensification of our urban environments. So what we're ultimately talking about is sustainable intensification. Bringing all those people together will impact the way we work, the way we expect people to be educated, the way people expect to be employed, the way we deliver services. And ultimately, that will fundamentally change how we go about addressing some of the bigger challenges associated with smart cities and associated with urban living. We also know that to feed an extra 2 billion people, we need to grow more food in the next 50 years than we have in the last 500 years. So in the time since Christopher Columbus, for all that period up until now, we need to grow that much food or produce that many calories in the next 50 years in order to feed that extra 2 billion people. And there are changing expectations associated with a changing population. People expect more and more that they have a higher standard of living, they have a higher quality of living, they have a higher quality of health, they have a higher quality of education, and a higher quality of entertainment. All of those things come with an environment of no more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have. So in order to take all of those finite share of resources and deliver to an extra 2 billion people with growing expectations, we really do have a sustainable intensification challenge. So one of the issues, of course, is that a lot of the challenges we look at, whether it's moving people around, whether it's educating, whether it's feeding, whether it's doing things the traditional way, the physical world has limitations associated with finite resources, finite capacity, finite flows, finite throughput. But a lot of things start to change when we think about digital delivery of services. And many, many things that we once upon a time considered a service, which we could map into a paper process or map into movement of objects, more and more of that we can actually put into a digital world and create value in a digital environment. And interestingly, when we start talking about moving bits and not atoms, some of the conventional challenges that Australia has faced of sparse population, of long distances between urban centres, certainly long distances between Australian markets and international markets, a lot of those challenges which are really associated with moving atoms around start to disappear. If you're connected with reliable, affordable communications which operates at an appropriate speed, if you're moving bits around, you can generate digital value, you can generate digital services anywhere, and you can consume them anywhere. If what you're creating is a piece of software or a logo or a design or doing someone's physics homework, if you can put that into a digital environment and you can create that service anywhere, you can consume it anywhere. There's no such thing anymore as the middle of nowhere. And the question, of course, is just how much value can we bring into that digital world from the physical world? And the more we can bring into the digital world, the more we can create value, and the more we can bring that whole process, that end-to-end process together, the more we can actually deliver value anywhere, consume value anywhere, and truly start to become a global market. And the question, of course, is just how far can you go? Now, when we start to talk about what is digitizable, it starts to push people's imagination a little bit. We all know that banks went online. We know that shopping went online. We know that buying travel went online. And that's led to a high degree, not only of new transactions which take place online, they're relatively low cost, we can compare things, and we can inform ourselves a whole lot better. But we also know that we can get a high degree of personalization. And the question is just how personal can it get, and how far can we stretch that concept of personalization of digital services? Now, this gentleman here in the top right-hand corner, that's Len. Len needed a new heel. This is a real example of someone operating in Australia. And what happened with Len is they imaged his foot, they imaged his heel, They used a variety of different scanning techniques and created a digital version of Len's existing heel, and then designed a new one. They designed a new one using a digital environment. They tested it in the digital world, and then they printed it out just in time to implant it into Len's heel. And everything about that process, from the scanning to the design to the testing, and only when it was printed out for the very first time, all of that was done digitally. And of course, it allows a very personal solution to be developed for Len, just as he needs it, just when he needs it. So data is something which not only allows great personalization of services, but this idea of everything as a service really starts to become quite pervasive when you think about what we've typically done and how our economy works. Many people now will know that Australia is a predominantly services economy. We used to think of ourselves as mining and shearing, that we were a dig it up and ship it, or a shear it, shoot it, ship it economy. Now really we are an economy of service deliveries. And those services are very, very wide ranging. But the biggest sector of the economy by size is actually the financial services market. And a financial service is something which very readily maps into a digital service. But when you start to think about all the other sort of services that could be created, more and more of them have a digital analogy, and more of the things that we've always taken for granted start to become conceivable as a service. We're all now familiar with software as a service, compute as a service, storage as a service. But more and more of the sort of things that relate to every part of our life could be considered as a service. Uber is a great example of mobility as a service. Uber doesn't own the taxis, Uber doesn't employ drivers. They provide a service which allows us to have mobility. And interestingly, the most important asset that Uber has is actually their data. Historically, we've talked about the factors of production of being land, labour, capital, and entrepreneurial spirit, entrepreneurial skill. If Uber wants to double the size of its addressable market and take on twice as many customers and twice as many drivers, they admittedly need a little bit more land, a little bit more capital, a little bit more labour, and perhaps a little bit more entrepreneurial skill. But what they need is more data. Data is, in fact, the biggest factor of production for companies like Uber. And companies like Uber are digital service delivery companies. And interestingly, it's a very interesting model in the sense that we give our data to Uber in order to match our need to travel with a driver who's got a vehicle to provide, so to provide a ride share. But if you look at all the data that's provided, that we willingly provide to Uber, we provide destination, we provide origin, we provide credit card, the things that you'd expect. But Uber actually also asks, or the app asks, to access your contacts, your microphone, your camera, and a variety of other things which don't necessarily seem obvious at first glance as to how you would provide that service. But what Uber is doing is developing a better understanding of you as a customer in order to give you a much more specific and targeted and personalized service. And in effect, what Uber is doing is creating a marketplace where we give our data into that marketplace, which is matched against people willing to offer rides, which encourages more people to offer their data, which encourages more specific and personalized services, which encourages more people to give their data. And the virtual loop there creates more and more refined and higher quality services based on us sharing data and drivers sharing data, which become more and more personal. But I mentioned that data is the most important factor of production. If the data of Uber or LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter was turned off, the value of these companies would absolutely plummet. You could take 2 zeros off the value of these companies easily. Data remains the most important asset these companies have to create the services through their, as a platform, service provision. If the data went away, the companies would disappear. They would not be able to provide the services, they would not be able to customize the services, they would not be able to personalize the services. So data is actually the most important factor of production, but interestingly, it's not recognized anywhere in the value of a company. It's not recognized anywhere on the balance sheet, and it's not recognized anywhere as a traditional factor of production. Let's stay with the idea of just how digital we could actually get. Back in 2010, a gentleman called Qua did an analysis of where all the economic activity was around the planet, at least looking at 700 major locations, and tried to plot what he considered to be the economic centre of the planet. And he looked back in time to 1980 and then projected forward. But in 1980, he said, not at all surprisingly, that the economic centre of the planet was probably over the North Atlantic. So given all the activity in the US, North America, and Western Europe, economic centre is probably reasonably somewhere in the North Atlantic. But then he started to plot as that moved over time. And in 2010, he said it's around about the Middle East. And if you think about the dot-com and the tech giants of Nokia and Ericsson and various other companies, Siemens, it's not at all surprising that Europe was starting to see a bit more of a pull. But then he projected forward as India and China started to rise. And depending on exactly how they were going, his prediction was that by 2030, the economic centre of the world would actually be somewhere in Asia. He also looked at what was driving that economic activity. And in 1980, there was quite a lot of movement of physical goods around the world. There were delivery of commodities between developing countries and developed countries. There was movement of manufactured goods between developed countries and to developing economies. But over time, what we started to see was that data itself was starting to be used not just to confirm a trade or to acknowledge or to make the phone calls to coordinate, but data itself was actually starting to become the product. And by that, you can think of downloading a piece of software, downloading a license, downloading an in-game app, or some sort of in online purchase. Data itself was actually starting to be not just the service enabler, but the thing that people were buying. And anyone who's ever bought extra skills or extra capabilities or extra outfits during a massive online game will understand that digital products as well as digital assets are really, they have real tangible value. But most of us are more commonly associated with downloading music files or downloading movies, which are in effect just data. What also changed over this time was who was trading with whom. Initially, there are developing and developed economies trading in a very particular sort of way, mostly primary materials from developing economies and manufactured or high value goods from developed economies. But as the ability for economies to develop value through digital services or digital products started to grow, who was developing and who was trading with whom started to fundamentally shift. And in the post-2010 era, we see that there is an incredible increase in the amount of data which is flowing through international connections, from an estimated 84 petabytes a month in 2000 to an estimated 40,000 petabytes a month in 2012. And the figures for 2016 I haven't yet seen, but absolutely they will be now measured in zettabytes of data transfer, because data itself is becoming the item which is being traded. But let's take an Australian example. Let's imagine it's 2030 and Australia needs some new submarines. And the ones we've got have done a great job, but we've decided we want to buy a new set. Those submarines could be designed anywhere: France, Germany, Japan. They could be tested in a digital environment. They could be validated using very sophisticated simulation tools. And the files could be shipped to, let's say, Adelaide, where the different parts of the submarine would then be printed out and then assembled. With 3D printing, we can print very sophisticated pieces of technology. Think again of Lead's heel, which was a titanium heel being printed out. Pieces of the submarine could be printed out, could be assembled, could be tested, and then digitally, the results could be confirmed back to the people who provided the designs and back to the people who had the licenses for the various different pieces of intellectual property that were used to create that submarine. All of that process, including the validation, when we start to think about technologies such as blockchain, where we can validate a contract, we can validate that, yes, it was the Australian government that printed those submarines, and yes, we printed 3, not 4, thank you very much. All of that could actually be validated. That last step, which historically would go back into the physical world, we can now start to think about using technologies like blockchain to digitally enable, digitally confirm, and digitally validate all of the different stages of that. which means that every single part of that process, except for the commodity that's needed to print out the submarine, whether it's titanium or chocolate or whatever we print submarines out in 2030, and the process of system integration and sea trials could actually be done in the digital domain. So the scope and the reach of value creation in the digital domain is actually potentially much, much further than we currently conceive it to be. Now, whilst that's a slightly far-fetched scenario, it's not actually that far-fetched when we start to think about the sort of things that we did for Len with his heel, and the sort of things that we can start to push through printers of 3D printing technology. The question is, what does that mean for global trade? If we're moving atoms around and the value, much of the value is being created in the atoms in the digital world, then really the most important thing that we still need to ship around are commodities. And luckily, Australia's got lots of commodities. So if we involved in shipping raw titanium or raw chocolate, we've still got a future. The point of running through that is to identify that there are some very human challenges or very human-centered challenges that we face of sustainable intensification. The need to accommodate, educate, employ an extra 2 billion people in the next generation. The need for people to live together in an increasingly urbanized and a more intensive environment. We need to grow more food. We need to grow more food per acre, more calories per hectare than we ever have done before, with all of the finite physical resources. No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have. The part which still offers much potential is data. There's no known limit on how much data we can generate. There's no known limit on how much data we could consume. There's no currently known limit on what we could do to inform ourselves from these different sources of data. It really is an incredible opportunity that we're only just now beginning to scratch the surface on. And when we look through the world, or look at the world through the lens of data, what we're actually doing is data allows us to see the world. Data is a way of observing the world. It's not the world, it's a way of observing it. And everywhere we look, there are more and more ways that we can find data from conventional sources, but we know every single day we create such an incredible digital footprint from our engagement with mobile phones, from our use of credit cards, from our use of ticketing systems, from a variety of different systems and electronically enabled or digitally enabled technologies that we have about us in so many different ways that they have now almost become imperceptible. Data is a way of seeing the world, and if we are bold in terms of the data sets we use to address challenges, we can get some really amazingly different perspectives on a challenge that we're interested in. Science is a way of understanding the world. And coming back to that point about embracing the complexity of the challenges we're interested in addressing, if we bring those two together, the data and the science, we develop a new set of tools for addressing some of those wicked, complex, subtle challenges that we face today. And by embracing that complexity and looking at the entire joined up experience of a child, a family, a household, a community, an ecosystem, a business, a building, or even a city, and embracing as much of that complexity as we can cope with, we have the opportunity to think about much more of the actual problem as opposed to the problem that we simplify away because as human beings, we don't cope with complexity. So it means that we've got a new set of tools to understand the problem differently, to predict outcomes based on identifying risk factors, or to explore that what-if scenario for things like optimization of transport or for things like different alternatives for smart cities. We also have a way of undertaking evaluation of just how effective those different interventions were, those different plans were, those different schemes were. But here's the challenge. If we think about a smart anything, a smart city, a smart factory, a smart lighting system, smart transport, it relies on linking and analysing vast quantities of data. And interestingly, at the Data Analytics Centre, which is where I spend my days working in the New South Wales government, we deal with all sorts of data, from open data, to highly aggregated data, to lightly aggregated data, and even touching on personal data and personal data with health information in it. Believe it or not, dealing with those two ends, those two extremes of that spectrum are actually relatively straightforward. Open data means that you can do more or less whatever you like. Personal data and personal with health, there are very strict protocols you need to follow. There are ethics approvals you need to achieve, and there's a whole series of justifications you need to go through, but at least it's clear. What you need to do is clear, if not easy. The challenge we have is everything else, because at the moment, there's no way to unambiguously tell, to algorithmically tell whether there's personal information in the sets of data sets you're looking at. And that tends to drive some really challenging behaviors. People who need to share data or are required to share data or want to share data will either push to one extreme and aggregate or obfuscate or perturb the data so much that a lot of the value is lost, or push the other way and say we can't do it because of the Privacy Acts in different jurisdictions, and you need to follow the protocols associated with sharing or engaging with personal information, which means ethics approval, qualifying researchers, police checks, background checks, and a variety of other ways of making sure that you're releasing information in a safe environment. So one of the things we've been doing is thinking about the fact that more and more data can be used to provide really powerful insights to some of the biggest challenges that we have today. Whether we're thinking about climate change, whether we're thinking about that sustainable intensification, whether we're thinking about agricultural productivity increase, whether we're thinking about how we educate or help deliver services to people in an increasingly intensely populated environment. With how do we understand the population, taking advantage of those incredible new variety of data sets means that we've got new ways of understanding the problem. But unless we solve the challenge of what happens when you start to link those data sets together and analyze them, we will never produce a smart lighting system. We'll never produce even a smart kettle, because it can be said that there's some aspect of personal information about your behavior, about your engagement, or either inferred or observed information which is about you personally, which goes into needing to create that service. So we spent a bit of time working with the good folks with the ACS, with CSIRO, with Standards Australia, with various different governments around Australia, including New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, with Commonwealth Government, with some companies that are really household names, a big bank, a big telco, a big credit card company, a big consulting firm, and a variety of other interested people, lawyers, privacy advocates, privacy commissioners themselves, trying to think through the challenges of data sharing, which preserve privacy, but still allow the value to be captured and utilized. There's a link to the paper. We started this activity almost 2 years ago now, and in September last year, we produced a technical white paper that says there are challenges around data sharing which are technical. There are challenges around data sharing which relate to the ambiguity of regulation and policy. There are challenges around social norms. There are challenges around context. There are challenges around trust. But the paper produced got to the point where we said, we think it's not worse than this. We think it's not worse than this. We think it's not worse than this. The problem's in here somewhere. And we started to develop a framework for thinking through how we would address the challenges of data sharing, how we would ultimately create practical data sharing frameworks. The link on the slide in front of you is the September 2017 technical white paper. It's 104 pages. It's a beautiful read. If you're having trouble sleeping on a Friday night, have a read of that, and it will help you off from blissful sleep. It's something you can download from the ACS website. But what we did, we started looking at the data sharing from a couple of different challenges. And the first challenge was around the ability to decide. Most regulations talk about personal information being the reasonable likelihood of re-identification of an individual. And in New South Wales, it's living or dead, and dead up to 30 years, which has its own challenges. But reasonable starts to be a challenge. If you're thinking about linking data sets together, I could give you one data set and you could make a reasonable determination if you thought there was personal information in that data set. But if I said I'm going to link together these 100 data sets or these 1,000 data sets, the ability to reasonably decide starts to become a very difficult concept. Most people would not be able to make a reasonable determination if they were given 1,000 data sets and told they were going to be linked together. So at some point, the ability to decide starts to break down. And the default very often is that it must be personal because there's so much data in there. But we asked ourselves the question, could we unpack this problem into different environments and then discuss what that reasonable means? We also asked the question about if we're dealing with unit record level data, so we've created a joined up understanding of that journey of a child, a family, a household, someone who's involved in an accident. If we've got de-identified data, is it the same as being able to say it's John Smith? Is that unit record level data the same always as saying we've got reasonable ability to re-identify an individual? Or are there ways of identifying information that you must withhold which would stop that re-identification to a certain level of risk? We also asked the question about something called the radius of convergence. If we keep adding data sets together, must we arrive at personal information? And most people by default will just say yes. But here on the desk that I'm sitting at, talking to you, there's a coffee cup. Now I could add 100 years worth of weather data to that coffee cup and not get any closer to personal information. But if I said that coffee cup was sitting in a certain building, on a certain floor, in a certain office, at a certain time of day, you could start to see very quickly how you would get the personal information by linking data sets. But is it always the case? We talked about uniqueness and what's the smallest number or smallest group that you would share information about. Very often when statistics get released, they're aggregated up to a level which is, for an example of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they often talk about SA level 1, statistical area 1, statistical area 2, statistical area 3. Companies share data at different levels. When Opal card data in New South Wales was released, it was aggregated to a certain level. And the question is, what's the level, what's that smallest level of cohort that data could safely be released? And how do you contextualize that so that you understand for this type of data, it would be this level, released to that person, it would be that level, or for this sort of data, it would be aggregated to a different level. And finally, we acknowledge that data sharing happens in trusted environments in context. Context is important, and the level of trust is important. People share data about themselves on Facebook with their trusted group of friends. People share data with government in a different context. People share data with the broader community in a different level of trust. So trust and context are very, very important aspects of data sharing. We asked ourselves the question, could we actually automate trust? Could we calculate trust in a way where we've got standard international units of trust that we could determine in a given context and given situation? And believe it or not, the problem does start to become amenable to calculating trust, just as we can calculate how much information is in a file, how much information is in an event, how much information is associated with broadcast of a picture or a television image. We could potentially apply a similar approach to calculate how much trust is in a transaction. Fairly early days, but it was a very interesting exercise to carry out. I'm going to just dig into one of those just slightly deeply before I end the presentation. And that question was around the ability to decide. And ultimately what we're trying to do is create frameworks to help people think through the problems of data sharing. We've had many, many people raise a number of challenges around data sharing which relate to the practical world. But we said, let's see if we could break it down into when we're in an analytical environment. So we've got a closed environment where we have a finite amount of data which is being analyzed and linked. Let's think about when the results of that get released and a researcher or an analyst sees the result. And there's that risk of spontaneous re-identification because every person carries their own experience, every person has their own knowledge and their own context, their own worldview. And then what happens when you release the result into the outside world where there's lots of other data which potentially can be linked, there's lots of other information that potentially can be joined with an analytical result. And if we separate out those three environments, it actually becomes a little easier to think about the problem. The cohort analysis, we also thought about whether or not it's always the case in these different environments, whether or not there is some information that you can identify which says that if you do not have that information, then having a cohort size of 1 is not the same as a re-identification of John Smith. For different circumstances in different contexts, can we identify information that if we do not join it, means that we are unable to re-identify it? And that becomes very clearly contextual. If we have information about a rock star visiting Sydney and we know where their concerts are on, and if we're tracking transport movement through the rail network, we might, knowing the rockstar, knowing the movements, we might be able to infer that a particular person using the rail network is that rockstar based on an understanding of that contextual information that we have about them. But in other circumstances, if we don't have that contextual information, then it's actually much, much more challenging to say that any person riding the rail system is John Smith. So that the context of that is a really important factor. Let me just skip on a little bit and talk about the point of practical data sharing frameworks, because I do want to wrap up reasonably soon. Many people will be familiar with what's called the 5 safes model, which is a model which is adopted by a range of different groups, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which says that if you're going to carry out an analytical activity, and that analytical activity may be as simple as just joining and sharing data sets together, then there's a way of describing risks in a framework which talks about safe people, safe project in a safe setting with safe data, and then ultimately releasing safe output, which allows you to mitigate risks. You can screen people, you can do police checks, you can do working with children checks. With the project, you can do ethics evaluations, you can ask the question, should we be doing this project? The setting is mostly a technological challenge. The data itself talks about that. Is there personal information in the data? Is there a risk of spontaneous re-identification? And the outputs, of course, are when we release those results. And that model works really well, provided you've got 100% safe people, 100% safe projects, and very good screening of these different technologies and penetration testing and so on. But we're interested in, could we do a project or could we carry out an activity where we've got a 50% safe person working on a 35% safe project in a 100% safe setting? And all the different possible combinations of those, because ultimately we're interested in wide-scale algorithmic sharing of data, which preserves trust and preserves privacy in any context, in any circumstance. So we've been exploring the setting. We've been looking at what part of this problem is a strictly technical issue that we could control through audit and that we could control through ensuring that things, we can mathematically prove outcomes, we can absolutely guarantee outcomes. So a technology part versus a people and process part. We can screen researchers, we can do police checks, or if we can't do that, then this is the level of information we can release. Or if it's going out into a much broader environment, this is the level of information we can release. And give access to data at different levels of aggregation, perturbation, obfuscation, depending on who it's going to under what circumstances. But there's also a part which really is not just the technical part, but validating whether it's personal information, but actually really is that people and process, and then ultimately questions of judgment and questions of ethics. So breaking the problem down into a technical component, the people and process component, and the judgment and ethics component means that we've got a framework for thinking about who gets access to data, who gets to engage with a project, who gets to see the outcome, and at what level of aggregation, so that we preserve trust and we preserve privacy. And this work is ongoing. The data sharing task force has now been taking those recommendations and from the technical white paper from September last year, and is starting to look at how you would make this work in practice in a situation where we're talking about vast data sharing at algorithmic rates, which provably preserves privacy and provably preserves trust. But one of the main challenges remains the very end of that process when you release the results to the outside world. Now, in this case, we do try to separate issues of privacy from issues of sensitivity. Privacy really speaks about that regulatory environmental, that legal requirement to not re-identify an individual, whereas sensitivity means that you've carried out a set of activities and the results you produce may be surprising or may be somewhat disturbing to various different stakeholders who participate in it. So one of the things we've done is also tried to think about whether or not the governance of a project as it runs through that activity could be stepped up over time as the value of the outcomes start to become more important. So running around that clock, but breaking it into safe people and projects and setting and data and outputs, as we do the work, as we link, as we analyze, as we predict, as we do the what if, the value of the results become more significant. And so the question then becomes, do we need to come back and reevaluate issues of privacy? reevaluate issues of even ethics as that project evolves and as the value of the outcome evolves. And we postulated that it's possible to develop an agile ethics process, an agile privacy impact process, which as the project progresses, there are different ways of doing a check, evaluating the technology parts, the people and process parts, and the judgment and outcomes ethics part. And again, this is a work in progress, but it's starting to look to be practical. But it relies very heavily on our ability to fundamentally control, from a technology perspective, the most basic analytical part, where we're looking at things in the analytics own environment. Then have good systems and processes for evaluating safe people and safe projects. Then have good ways of aggregating, perturbing, and linking at a much more aggregated level the results, so that we still share with broader community, but in a way which, to a very high probability, does not allow re-identification of individuals. Final slide, we produced a set of recommendations which, from the technical white paper, which we're now trying to make real. We're trying to really identify how projects would be made real through this framework. And that clarifying the existing legal frameworks is one of the most important things that we need to do. What does reasonable mean in the world that we can link and process at gigahertz rates, and we can conceivably manage to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of data sets? What does reasonable mean? And what does it mean in the context of the sorts of levels of potential re-identification that we've talked about? Can we develop national standards for anonymization, national standards for re-identification, national standards for obfuscation and perturbation, which are standard techniques to ensure that you can never produce a cohort size which is less than a certain number? Irrespective of how much linkage you do, will not be able to break that cohort down any further because you've done perturbation, obfuscation, or some technique that you will never be able to re-identify an individual. And can we actually mathematically determine in a set of data what the amount of personal information is in that data set, and therefore agree minimum cohort sizes which reflect the risk of re-identification? It's a work in progress. This is something which is open to anyone within the ACS, but as I've also mentioned, we cast the net much, much wider than the ACS, working with Standards Australia, with CSIRO, other jurisdictions, companies, privacy commissioners, former privacy commissioners, and legal folks, trying to explore and understand just the different aspects and how do we actually make it real. So at that point, I'm going to pause for breath. Thank you very much for your kind attention, for those who've stayed on the line, and I'm sure we'll be happy to take any questions.
Wow, absolutely amazing. Thanks, Ian. And I don't think there's anything you miss in those. I do have one question. I think you briefly touched on this, and everyone, we don't get the opportunity to have someone like Ian present, so please send some more questions through. But how is the security been working when we talk about digitisation, like say personal data?
So personal data is assuming that we've actually got personal data, and we can therefore identify that we need to follow different protocols. There are some there are some gold standard approaches which take place. In New South Wales, there's something called the Centre for Health Records Linkage. Its acronym is CHERL, which operates out of New South Wales Ministry of Health, that we work through, and it's a double-blind process of linking data sets together. So Justice will have a certain record where name is one field. Health will have a different record where name is one field. And the template is handed to Cheryl. Cheryl then does a matching of those and creates a linkage key back to the agencies. Agencies then apply that linkage key, and then the data sets are joined. And as a consequence of that, no one ever gets to see what name means in someone else's data, but they know what it means in their own data set. And ultimately, when that set's delivered, that double-blind process means that at no point did anyone ever see those same fields get lined up. It's a complex process. It's been operating in New South Wales for, I think, almost 15 years, and it's a highly secure process. Once we take then custody of the anonymised data set, then we do the normal standards-based ISO 27000 series standards-based test for penetration testing and for the security of the systems we operate. And then it's the people and process. So ensuring that we've got people who are qualified, they know what they're doing, they've been checked for police checks, working with children checks, in some cases national security checks, and we've got the protocols and the regular audits. So when we're dealing with personal information, it's like we're dealing with a highly contagious vaccine. All the steps we need to take are in place because we know that if data leaks, then we have a massive problem of trust.
Yeah. Okay. And just one, how can you link project management and data management?
That's a very good question as well. So we separate the project delivery from the data governance and data steward process, the Chinese wall, because what we don't ever want to have happen is that someone, in order to meet their project deadline, can force or insist that data be supplied in an inappropriate way. So we deliberately create that tension, and we have different governance and different review processes for both. Now, the data sharing frameworks that we've implemented rely on an evolution of this SAFES model, and at the moment we're operating at the most safe end. But as I mentioned, what we're trying to do is put in place between the world of open data, which let's call it white data, and closed data, which we might call black data or highly secure data. We're looking for those shades of grey. And once we develop the protocols around sharing data in an automated way, which with little human intervention is possible, then the data governance process becomes a little easier, and the data project process becomes a little easier, because you'll only get access to data which is appropriate for the project that you're carrying out and for the environment you're looking to share in.
Yeah, great. Just a couple more, if you don't mind. And how can we raise safety of personal data for individuals?
Safety of personal data. So personal data is a really interesting challenge, and many people talk about people willingly sharing their personal data on Facebook, and we just saw with Cambridge Analytica what happens with when companies take advantage of that personal data to create what they might perceive as value. Part of the challenge we have is that we don't control our own data, and it's actually not controllable. We could control data which is a transaction with a doctor or a dentist, but we can't control data which is observed of us. We can't control data which comes from generated by a mobile phone. We can, more and more, I think we need to actually develop frameworks of value for that data. This is how valuable the data is to us. This is what happens if we lost access to it. This is what would happen if we lost exclusivity to it. And build frameworks for understanding the value, which then mean that we can either put in place personal frameworks or activities, or in fact, governments could start to talk about regulation which would require that data of that particular sort of that particular value to be treated in different ways. So I think the problem is very poorly understood at the moment. Those value frameworks are not well understood. We've done some work to try and look at what data, the value of data to companies, to individuals, and to government is. And of course, they interlock with each other. But until we get those value frameworks sorted out, I don't think we don't yet have the structures to actually think through how we would safeguard our own data, or how we would move from not having any control to actually requiring or enforcing or enabling control.
Fantastic. And do you have any recommendations or kind of best practice advice around data obfuscation? Sorry, it's the first time I've heard that word today. It's a new one for me.
So we will put out some recommendations quite soon. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has some really good best practice at the moment around built into something they have called Table Builder, which is something that anyone can get access to. And that essentially uses algorithms to do that obfuscation. We're trying to get much more granular with our data so that we can do things at a much more granular spatial or temporal level, while still preserving the privacy and the trust of that data which is being shared, and also who it's being shared with. Yeah. So we will publish in the not too distant future some guidelines around perturbation obfuscation. CSIRO put out something, CSIRO Data 61 put out something recently, which is around the risk frameworks for re-identification, which is the flip side of the problem. If you have data, these are the ways to evaluate the risk of re-identification. So there is already something good. Search for Christine O'Keefe from Data61 CSIRO. If people search for that, but as I said, we'll be putting out something hopefully this calendar year.
Excellent. And there's been a recent approach to privacy taken in Europe, and it sounds a lot more legal or political than, I suppose, what's described. How can we develop frameworks to support their decisions, and are there any activities around the world kind of looking into this?
So part of what I do for fun is to work with some international standards bodies, the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, and JTC1, which is a collaborative activity between IEC and ISO.
Yeah.
So I've been participating in that for quite some time, and I've recommended that, having looked around and not seen anything which is standardised in the space, that they start to develop standards which ultimately Standards Australia would adopt and bring about a national standard. Mm. There is great work done on governance. There's great work done on the 27,000 series cybersecurity, but there is a gap simply because the issue associated with information creation when data sets are joined is poorly understood. And this was our attempt with the ACS to try and build those frameworks. But there's a lot of work to be done. In terms of the European regulation, so they've recognised the problem but haven't really solved it. But that general data protection regulation comes into effect this month. The Commonwealth Office of the Information Privacy Commission at Commonwealth level has good guidance on their website, which I'll direct you to. But it's the GDPR, as it's known, is very comprehensive. Hopefully will only peripherally impact most of Australia, but it does have extraterritorial reach. So if you're dealing with data from Europeans, you need to be aware of the GDPR. I recommend the Information Privacy Commission at the Commonwealth.
Okay. And how can we differentiate between, say, data and content? It is often interchangeably used in information management systems. What are your thoughts?
So that's a very interesting question. I went to an event, a World Wide Web Consortium event this morning, where their view was that there's no difference between the two, between metadata and all the data which is generated around content. I still suspect that that's not quite right. But in terms of how you handle it, the content, the payload, is what we're trying to protect or treat appropriately. But all the data around the provenance of that content, around what we would typically call metadata, has almost as much value, and in some cases as much value. So our approach is to treat them exactly the same from a protection and governance perspective.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose you said in the presentation about evolutionary governance framework, if it has safe people, a safe project, a safe setting, but not having safe data, how do we check the risk value based on technical and people check?
So it's a doozy of a problem, and as human beings, we don't like complexity. So we're trying to break the problem down into, by the way, our new safes is almost certainly going to be 7 safes. So it'll be the 5+2 safes model, but let's see where we land on that. We've tried to really, for each one of those safes, using that as a framework try to identify what it looks like in the closed analytical environment where no human being sees the result. When you first release the result to a qualified, trusted, screened researcher, and then when you release the results to the outside world, to everybody, and trying to think through the frameworks that make sense in those different cases. And where we've got to now is a better quantification of that. And what we're trying to do now is identify what the really the hard points are, and then what the policy process judgment points are. So that's still a work in progress. Stay tuned. We'll put out another technical white paper this year, and there'll be a lot more information. We'll also include some information about obfuscation.
Fantastic. And I think one last good one here. It's how do you see the development, because you mentioned around e-health, and it's probably one of the most sensitive areas, and how do you see the development of sharing protocols across federal and state boundaries, more so in that e-health space?
So that is probably the opportunity for the greatest productivity and quality enhancements is in the area of health. It's a big challenge, but we're working towards it. Department of Social Services, so starting with social services as opposed to health services, has produced something called the Data Exchange platform, where they're looking at a version of what we're talking about, but it's still very early steps. And we're looking about how we can connect data across in a way which is trust preserving. But the simple answer is that the legal frameworks, the risk aversion and the caution which is being shown. And understandably, I mean, people are cautious, in particular in government, for good reasons. So the caution people are showing, it has made that slow going. There are real efforts towards trying to understand health and human services from both a state and Commonwealth level, which allows us to get the greater picture. And given just how sensitive those data sets are, everyone's taking very cautious steps in those directions.
Yeah, as it would be. I suppose from an ACS member, industry, and a professional perspective, how can we support you on this, Ian? And what can we do at a broader picture across, nationally and in the States to drive some of this change?
So we've had great support in terms of the thinking and the workshop and the doing to date. We've got workshop, I'm going to say 11 coming up soon. This is the 11th half-day workshop where we've been digging into this, and we've had an incredible variety of people and different interests who've chewed this problem for us. And every time we start a workshop, I think we've got the answer. Every time we finish, we realise there's another aspect to it we hadn't considered. But it's been a very fruitful activity, so people are certainly welcome to participate in those. They've been held so far Sydney and Canberra. They're certainly open to anybody within the ACS who wants to come along. I encourage you to read the white paper first. The second thing is, as we develop the next technical white paper and we start to test this, at least in New South Wales government, there's a broader conversation we need to have around the social licence component, which really speaks to the just because we can, should we do that? So raising awareness is important, but having the conversation within the society, I think, is important, and then having the conversation with the broader Australian community, I think, is absolutely important. But awareness is where it starts.
Great. Excellent. Look, Ian, fantastic presentation, and all I can see is really positive feedback coming through, and I can tell everyone's really appreciative of your time and sharing of your knowledge today. And just one more look, this is a technical white paper that Ian's produced with us, downloaded from the website, but phenomenal read, and as you said, quite a large document, but that's all right, some light reading on a Sunday. But look, Ian, thank you so much, mate. Really appreciate your time and participation today. And I'll share any kind of feedback, and also if anyone wants to kind of engage with the activities that we're doing with ACS. So, mate, have a great day and really appreciate everything you've done.
Thanks all very much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ross. Bye.
See ya.